I've seen many examples where there has been complete abandonment of reason. Groupthink, media bias has led to this, but there is nowhere that I have seen a worse example of what we are currently witnessing on the war on the drug hydroxychloroquine. It is not about whether my opinion thinks the drug is effective or not, Deputy Speaker. It's about whether the big hand of government has the right to interfere in the doctor-patient relationship and to say to the doctor that you cannot prescribe this drug to your patient if you think not only it would help them, but it may save their life. That's what we're currently doing in Australia. At the state level, we have state governments that are putting rulings in that are actually making a doctor liable to go to prison if he prescribes hydroxychloroquine to one of his patients if he thinks it may save their life. Now, what is this based on, Deputy Speaker? Well, it's based on the findings of our National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force. And their recommendations are, and I quote, "Based on the available evidence, hydroxychloroquine is potentially harmful and no more effective than standard care in treating patients with COVID-19. We therefore recommend that hydroxychloroquine should not be used." So, Deputy Speaker, how did they come to that recommendation? Well, that goes on. Evidence informing this recommendation comes from 9 randomised trials that compared hydroxychloroquine plus standard care to standard care alone. But, Deputy Speaker, when you go and you look at those 9 trials that they looked at, not one of them looks at the way hydroxychloroquine, or the doctors that advocate for this drug, say it should be used. The doctors say it should be used with zinc and also an antibiotic such as azithromycin, Deputy Speaker. Difficult word to say for non-medical people. That is how they advocate it for, and also that it must be prescribed and taken in the first 5 days after someone becomes infected. But, Deputy Speaker, none of those 9 trials that this evidence task force looked at actually looked at the drug under those circumstances. So they really, Deputy Speaker, should simply be completely irrelevant to what their recommendation is. But it gets worse, Deputy Speaker. They go on, "The vast majority of evidence is from the recovery trial, which randomised 4,716 hospital patients with COVID." The recovery trial, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, what they actually did in the recovery trial, which was in the UK, they gave the patients, sick patients, that had come down with COVID, that were very sick and were very frail, they gave them a dose of 2,400 milligrams of hydroxychloroquine in the first 24 hours. Now, that doesn't mean 2,400 milligrams doesn't mean much unless you compare it, Deputy Speaker. That is actually 4 to 6 times higher than the recommended dose. So they dosed these people up with a toxic overdose of this drug. And in fact, the French medical literature, Deputy Speaker, says that a dose of only 1,800 milligrams in the first 24 hours for someone that is 75 kilos is considered an overdose and can result in cardiac arrest and respiratory arrest. And yet in this trial, they loaded these people up with well above what is a known overdose. And Deputy Speaker, this scandal gets worse. A French magazine asked the gentleman behind this trial to explain the 2,400 milligrams. And I quote from the French magazine this is France Sur. And the quote was, "We have chosen the dosage that is in line with dosages for other diseases such as amoebic dysentery." And then, Deputy Speaker, Professor Perron said to that comment, "This is the first time I have learned that we have used hydroxychloroquine for amoebic dysentery in super toxic doses." He said the classic treatment for amoebic dysentery is another drug called hydroxyquinoline. And the doctor, this is a Professor Perron, he's concluded, "I think they confused hydroxychloroquine with hydroxyquinoline." And Professor Perron's quote was, this man who calls himself a doctor, the person behind this trial, is incompetent and dangerous. And yet, Deputy Speaker, this is the trial that our National COVID Evidence Task Force hold up as their gold standard as the reasons why they interfere in that doctor-patient relationship. In that study, Deputy Speaker, the studies resulted, Deputy Speaker, that so-called recovery trial, 27.5% of the people loaded up with that toxic dose died within 28 days, compared to 23% that didn't get that drug. This is an outrage and a disgrace. And yet, Deputy Speaker, as I said, this is what our Clinical Evidence Task Force is based upon. Now, what about a second opinion, Deputy Speaker, about hydroxychloroquine? Well, let's take a second opinion, Deputy Speaker, from a gentleman called Professor Harvey Risch. Now, who's Professor Risch? He's actually the Professor of Epidemiology at Yale, someone with almost 40+ years of experience. And his words were, and I quote, "I conclude the evidence is overwhelming. There is no question that for people who need to be treated and are treated early, hydroxychloroquine, has a very substantial benefit in reducing the risk of hospitalisation or mortality." He continued, "I am an expert in science, and I can tell you the science is all one-sided. In fact, the science is so one-sided in supporting this result, that is hydroxychloroquine is effective, that is stronger than anything else I've studied in my entire career." This is a gentleman with more than 45 years' experience as a medical doctor, and he says, "The evidence in favour of hydroxychloroquine benefit in high-risk patients treated early as outpatients is stronger than anything else I've studied." And yet, Deputy Speaker, we have bans on Australians being able to get this prescribed from their doctor. Now, Deputy Speaker, the idea that there are no studies that support this. Only yesterday, Deputy Speaker, there was a study from Belgium that looked at 8,075 hospitalised patients. 4,524 were given hydroxychloroquine as a treatment. Right? These are all patients that have contracted COVID, and they compared them against a group of 3,533, Deputy Speaker, that didn't get hydroxychloroquine. And the results were, Deputy Speaker, those that didn't get hydroxychloroquine had a 53% increased chance in dying. A 53% increase. And yet we have banned it, Deputy Speaker. Time doesn't allow me, but there is study after study after study, and yes, these are only observational studies, Deputy Speaker, but the chances of all these observational studies being wrong, statistically, are approaching zero, Deputy Speaker. And this study is from Spain, from Italy. They go on and they go on and they go on and they go on, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I'm asking our National COVID Evidence Task Force to look at the evidence, to make separate recommendations for the use of hydroxychloroquine as a prophylactis and also in the early stage of treatment. And because the recommendations they have made, Deputy Speaker, are only on evidence that is in a late stage of treatment. Now, Deputy Speaker, there are many brave doctors out there supporting this and speaking out against a media groupthink. One of them, Deputy Speaker, a brave doctor called Linda Kuvar out of Canada, and she said why she supports hydroxychloroquine. "My moral conscience won't allow me to silently watch people die and suffer when we have the means to save them." And I'll conclude, Deputy Speaker, with the words of Professor Risch. He said, "In the future, I believe this misbegotten episode regarding hydroxychloroquine will be studied by sociologists of medicine as a classic example of how extra scientific factors overrode clear-cut medical evidence. But for now, reality demands a clear scientific eye on the evidence and where it points. For the sake of high-risk patients, for the sake of our parents and grandparents, for the sake of the unemployed, for our economy and our polity, we must start